How do I build a team for Lunatic Plus level play in Fire Emblem Awakening? This is one of the questions that I get asked in the comments of my Lunatic Plus guide videos probably more than anything else. It makes sense. Honestly, for a long time, the most accepted way to play this game on Lunatic mode was to pair up Robin and Crom together, or get Frederick a good pair-up partner, and have one unit sweep through the entire game, while skipping most of the maps in the second half of the game. And for Lunatic Plus mode, barely any guides existed, period. So if you want that information on how to build a team, there's not really many places to find it. I've been trying to highlight different strategies that involve playing Awakening with a full team, the way you might play any other Fire Emblem game, even on Lunatic Plus. So when people see my guides and see me playing through the game with my full team, I often get asked, how do I do it? How are all of my characters so high level? How do I plan for team-based play? Which units do I use? And well, today we're going to cover that. We're going to cover all of it. So I hope you're ready, because this is going to take a while. First, we need to talk about deployment slots. Later in the game, there will be several important chapters where you can only deploy a limited number of characters. The most noteworthy chapter in this regard is Chapter 12. This port map is the last major difficulty spike in the game. You can't buy more rescue staves until after you beat this chapter, and you also unlock access to infinite master seals after you beat this chapter. It's not an exaggeration to say that the first 11 chapters of Fire Emblem Awakening and the side stories that you have access to in the beginning are all about managing your resources and preparing for Chapter 12. You need to conserve as many rescue staff charges as possible and make sure you spread your experience around efficiently. First, let's talk about rescue staves. They are the single most powerful tool in Lunatic Plus play, and the reason why I personally consider Lissa to be the best character in the game, even above Frederick. While Frederick's combat is certainly important in the early chapters, Lissa's ability to heal her allies is no less essential to winning. If Lissa perishes early on in an Iron Man style run, you might as well just reset the entire run. However, unlike Frederick, Lissa's not going to fall off over time. She just continues to get better and better and better as the game progresses. But most importantly, unlike Frederick, Lissa has access to staves. The rescue staff is so pivotal to the meta of this game on Lunatic Plus that any character who can access staves instantly becomes more viable and more worth including on your team. Many of the tactics that I'm about to describe also work very well for Lunatic style play, but they are nearly essential for Lunatic Plus. The best way to describe the rescue staff in as few words as possible is something like this. Think about the rescue and drop command in the GBA Fire Emblem games. In Fire Emblem 6, 7, and 8, these tactics can be used for LTC, they can boost your unit's movement, and you can also use it to engage with a dangerous enemy, but then pick up your unit and pull them back to safety. Well, here's the thing. The rescue staff does the exact same moves. You can use it to pick up and move another unit, either boosting them and allowing them to reach further on the map for LTC or other strategies, or using it for hit-and-run tactics. But it's even better than it was on GBA, because here in Awakening, we have the rescue staff. The staff only requires a single character. You don't need one person to rescue and one person to drop. Instead, with a single action, you can just pull your ally back to safety, or drag them across the map. Then, on top of that, you could rescue a unit from several tiles away. Even a unit with a low magic score is like having Marcus in FE6 being able to pick up Roy from 3 tiles away. Just imagine how many strategies this would open up. Imagine how amazing that would be. Well, you don't have to imagine that because we can do it. Awakening allows us to do that. And it's an E-rank staff, so every character can start using it as soon as they switch over to a staff-using class. Then, on top of all of that, characters with a high magic score can basically pick up units from even further away, from all the way across the map. An 8 or 9 tile rescue is pretty reasonable for an early promoted sage, or for Libra or Anna, basically the moment they join with no resources invested. They can just do this at base when they join. As far as I know, whenever I see people discussing the rescue staff, it's almost exclusively used to skip maps, or people spam it to gain experience on their staff users, which is absolutely nuts to me. I don't want to call out anybody specifically, but in a lot of the guides I've seen, people just talk about how you can spam the rescue staff to level up. I would never do that. I don't know if I'm the first person to come up with these tactics, but I'm the first person I've ever seen talking about the rescue staff in this way, using it like an actual item, and recognizing it for how powerful and how useful it is. And I did come up with all of this on my own. So please, don't just spam the rescue staff every turn to grind experience. Use it every single turn to selectively remove the most dangerous enemies from the map with hit-and-run tactics. Use it to boost your unit's movement and get them further across the map. The most key strategy for playing around counter is to have a strong unit run in, defeat that enemy, and then have your rescue staff user pull the character back to safety. When there are no counter enemies remaining in the enemy group, you can safely leave your enemy phase sweeper in range of the remaining group. Effectively, Lissa or any other staff user has the ability to turn down the difficulty slider for you. Lissa can change a group of enemies from Lunatic Plus to just Lunatic by removing any enemies with deadly skills from the enemy formation. It's no exaggeration to say that every single map in the second half of the game, I find myself wishing I had additional deployment slots, because I would fill every single extra space on my roster with more rescue staff users. Whenever I'm asked if I use low-man strategies in this game, or if I think low-man is the best, my answer is always the same. No. I don't want to low-man, I want more deployment slots. I want more staff users. It's so good. It's so underrated. Why has everyone been overlooking this strategy for 10 years now? So keeping this in mind about how good the rescue staff is, this fundamentally explains the core of our team building strategy. We know all three of the main things that we need to conquer Fire Emblem Awakening. Number 1, we need to deploy player phase attackers to remove the most dangerous enemy units. Number 2, we need to deploy rescue staff users to pull those attackers back to safety. And number 3, we need enemy phase sweepers, so that after the most dangerous threats have been removed, the enemy phase sweepers can stand in the middle of the enemy group and just clear them out on enemy phase. Now, in order to build this kind of team, it can often be helpful to distribute your experience at least somewhat efficiently. The more efficient you are, the better, of course. In a recent playthrough, I made the mistake of trying to raise up too many different units, and I ended up making my primary combat units a little bit too weak to handle the stress of Chapter 12, especially because I had very few rescue staffs available. By cutting Gregor and Pan from my roster and funneling more experience onto Frederick and Cordelia, I was able to make my group smaller and more optimized. This isn't the same as doing a low-man strategy, it's just making sure not to spread things out too thin. Now keep in mind, you can use units in the short term and then bench them later. There's nothing wrong with that. Virion, Kellum, Rickon, they're all really great examples of characters you can use in this way. My mistake was just that I went out of my way to get more experience onto units like Gregor and Pan, but then they ended up still being too weak to contribute. Additionally, if you fail to train specific characters for specific roles, there's typically replacement units that you can pick up later on. Anna is the prime example of this. She is a character who can fit into any team composition and basically save your game if you're lacking in a good staff user, a good lock touch unit, or even a good Levin sword user. She basically does everything from utility to combat, and her only weakness is her lack of supports. But before we start talking about specific characters, let's discuss what the overall team should look like. What is the ideal size for an optimized party? For the vast majority of the game, you're going to have 12 or 13 deployment slots. In some cases, especially in the second half, this increases up to 14 or 15. However, either way, you're definitely not going to train 13 characters. Most likely, you're going to train a smaller core of units with specific roles. 4 really good units and 4 units who support those 4 characters. And then you're going to fill the remaining slots by units who are just there to use rally or additional staff users, because you want as many staff users as possible. I personally like to have 4 characters who are very good at combat. After that, we need 4 primary support partners. Now, these characters can also be good at combat, and it's certainly useful if they are. However, if these characters are weak in direct combat, but they provide a strong bonus to your primary combat units, that's totally okay. Some of them you don't even really need to level up. We're going to break down these roles even further, but this is the briefest overview. With this, we've already filled 8 of our 12 deployment slots for Chapter 12, and then the remaining 4 spaces go to Olivia, and hopefully 3 staff users. Having more staff users is never a bad thing, and I typically won't deploy fewer than 3 staff users from around Chapter 12 to the end of the game. I will go into every map with 15 total rescue staff charges. I'm not going to use them all, but sometimes I actually end up using all 15 of them. And then, before I go into the next chapter, I will just restock all of my rescue charges on all 3 of my staff users. When you have leftover rescue staffs, you can also hand these to the characters who have secondary staff access. Because, notably, you can have characters fill multiple roles and provide all of combat support and utility. Cordelia is a good example of this. Promoting her directly into Falcon Knight, which I love to do, gives you an additional staff user right away. She's a great pair-up partner for Frederick or anyone else who just wants speed and a Pegasus to carry them around the map. And she can hold her own in combat, so depending on what you need on any given turn, Cordelia can either be paired up with her partner to give them an awesome +7 speed, she can pair up with another character to still give them a respectable, around +5 speed, she could heal an ally, she can fly anywhere that she needs to in order to heal, you can have her fly around and use rescue staves to reposition her other units, and because her combat is good, even after she uses the rescue staff, it's probably fine to just leave her in range of an enemy or two. You could even have Kellum or Frederick pair up with Cordelia in order to boost her defenses after she's used the rescue staff so that she's safer while being on the front lines. In this game, it's important to have characters like this who can be a flexible jack of all trades. However, it's also very important to have characters who are a master at one specific thing. So let's start talking about the exact specific roles where you need focused, developed, masterwork characters in those roles. First of all, I recommend having 2 tanks. They should be capable of enemy phase sweeping, and ideally you want them to have 2 different functions. For example, using Gregor and Vaike is not a good idea, because both of these characters are so similar. They're physically defensive, they hit really hard with physical attacks, and they're both weak against magical attacks. Well, if you need to sweep a group of enemies which is filled with magical attackers, or has a ton of enemies with physical bulk, you're going to run into a problem because neither Vaike or Gregor is good for this situation. Neither of your sweepers is capable of handling those types of enemies. It's better to have one physical sweeper, like Frederick or Vaike, who can wall a lot of physical threats, and then a magical sweeper like Robin, who handles magical attacks a little bit better and can also deal magic damage to target enemies with lower resistance. Now, unfortunately, this game doesn't have an equivalent to Ninja. Building high resistance tanks is actually kind of difficult. This is because enemy phase recovery is one of the most important properties of a tank in this game. The big problem is that there aren't many, maybe not even any units like Kaze, for example, who just have naturally high resistance, unrestricted 1-2 range, and the ability to access enemy phase healing. Even specifically, there's only a couple of characters early on who even have relatively high resistance. Lissa, Sumia, Maribel, and sort of Cordelia. Now, Sumia's resistance growth is adequate, but Cordelia's is pretty bad. Lissa and Maribel do have good resistance growths, especially Maribel. It also helps that Pegasus and Valkyrie have good resistance base stats. The problem is that none of these characters are really effective enemy phase sweepers, and none of them have enemy phase recovery. Later on in the game, you're actually going to get a surprisingly high number of characters who join the game with really solid resistance stats. Libra, Anna, Church, kind of, and near the end of the game, Flavia and Basilio actually have surprisingly high resistance, and they make for great late-game additions. But unfortunately, most of the early joiners can't really be trained for a specific mage-killing purpose. There's just not a Kaze in this game. Having a trained Sumia or Lissa or even Maribel isn't a bad thing. All 3 of them have a function on the team. It's just not this function. They can't be a primary tank. However, if you get into a situation where you need someone who can fight against 2 or 3 mages, you might be surprised to find that these typically frail characters can actually enemy phase sweep. It's just that none of them are suitable for the primary tanking role, because your primary tanks need to be characters who can constantly enemy phase sweep pretty much every turn of combat. And while having high resistance is good, they're mostly going to be facing groups of physical enemies or sometimes mixed enemy groups. Enemy phase recovery is just almost a requirement. Now let's discuss the options for building the primary tanking role. Without a doubt, Frederick is going to be your best option early on. He's basically the only option other than Robin, and even Robin takes a little while to get going. The problem is, Frederick doesn't fit into the framework of a long-term viable enemy phase sweeper. So, the issue with Frederick, he actually has 3 major problems. Number 1, low resistance. Number 2, relatively low speed. These ones you can work around. His speed is actually good enough in the early game that with a speed pair-up, he can continue to double things. The problem is, in the midpoint of the game, when you start running into promoted, fast enemies, he starts to require a speed pair-up just to avoid being doubled, and that's pretty bad. It doesn't make him completely useless, but it is a notable drop in his damage output since he's not attacking twice every combat anymore. His low resistance can be mitigated through several methods, or you can just have him not fight enemy mages and use your other primary tank for fighting the enemy groups with mages. It's a little inconvenient, but he can still work. See, there is a little bit of a problem with this already. If you're using a speed pair-up, you're probably not getting much resistance or defense. So early on, enemies are hitting Frederick for almost 0 damage, and then he doubles them in return with his Crom, Sumia, or Cordelia pair-up. This feels great. But then, later on, if you give him a speed pair-up just to avoid being doubled, his defense, I mean, it's good, but it's just not good enough. Enemies are going to be chunking him for 10 or 20 damage per hit, and then if you use a defense pair-up to try and fix this problem, then the issue is his speed goes down, and with lower speed, he's getting doubled, and getting doubled means he's taking even more damage. So overall, Frederick's tanking capability is going to fall off over time. You can continue to get serious use out of this guy for at least the first 10 or 11 chapters in the game. In my No Frederick challenge run, I still find myself missing normal Frederick contributions even in the middle and late sections of the game, because while he stops enemy phase sweeping, he can continue to be useful. But again, we're trying to find two really good enemy phase sweepers, and you can't really build Frederick to do this in the long term, or if you do, it's going to feel a little bit weaker and a little bit more inconvenient than a more optimized team. In the second half, if you can replace Frederick with a more optimized enemy phase sweeper, I think it's a good idea. And that brings me to the third problem with Frederick. He has no access to enemy phase recovery. The only way to survive an enemy phase sweep is by dodging enough attacks or taking so little damage that the enemies have no chance of killing him. We already talked about why after enemies start to promote and their stats start to increase, Frederick is not going to be able to minimize their damage to the extent that he needs to. So that just leaves Evasion. Now, Frederick is actually pretty good at Evasion. His starting Cavalier skills give him Outdoor Fighter, which is plus 10 evade in most situations, and his default class set actually includes the Wyvern line. Surprisingly, Wyvern has some of the best evasion skills in the game. Your primary tanks will probably be in a lead position away from the rest of the team, so Tantivy will always be active for 10 more evade. However, I'm not sure I would ever reset Frederick to a level 1 Wyvern to get this skill. It would be so much better if he could backlog inherit it the way that they do in Fates. On the other hand, Quick Burn is fantastic. The first few turns of combat are often the most essential and the most decisive, and getting 15 evade in the first few turns is a serious advantage. Then, on top of that, we have to talk about the Breaker skills. The Breaker skills are absolutely insane in Awakening. Well, fitting with the name, they are just broken. They're so good, it's unbelievable. The key factor is that in this game, your stats, other skills, and other factors like Weapon Triangle often give you enough evasion that you can seriously consider dodge tanking as a valid strategy. It's not always going to be guaranteed, but you can make those enemy hit rates drop to surprisingly low values to the point where you can absolutely rely on it. Especially if you're fighting 10 enemies and you only need to dodge one attack. But most importantly, you need to understand something. Every single point of evasion you get in Fire Emblem Awakening is actually worth more than 1 point, because of how hit and dodge rolls are calculated in this game. The basic explanation is that when an enemy tries to hit you, the game actually rolls 2 random numbers, and these 2 numbers are combined to check if the enemy will actually connect with their attack. It creates a numerical illusion where instead of 95 actually hitting 95% of the time, it hits more often, because the game wants the player to feel like their attack is hitting almost always, instead of being truly random. 95% attacks are not going to miss 1 out of 20 times. What this accomplishes is that attacks above 50% are more likely to succeed, and attacks below 50% are more likely to fail. Now, you might have just figured something out on your own with regards to the Breaker skills based on that statement alone. So first of all, Breaker skills give an insane minus 50 hit penalty to your enemy if they're using the wrong type of weapon. So with Swordbreaker, an enemy wielding a sword is going to have their hit chance reduced by 50%. Now, given the above facts on the dual random number system, this creates an important effect, which allows us to abuse how the game rolls random numbers because we know how the math works. There are effectively 3 situations you can ever get into in this game. Number 1, if an enemy was guaranteed to hit you, by giving them a minus 50 penalty, this will give you a chance to dodge instead, sometimes as much as turning a guaranteed hit into a 50-50 coin flip. Next, if the enemy normally has a high chance to hit you, this minus 50 penalty will always change it into a low chance to hit you. So going from 80 to 30 means the attack just went from more likely to succeed to being less likely to succeed. What do I mean by this? Well, let's start with a smaller number first to explain how it works. Lonku is a good character for this example because he starts with evade plus 10, and this highly underrated skill does way more than what it says. Let's imagine an enemy would normally display a 70% chance to hit Lonku. In reality, when the game says 70% chance to hit, the attack is actually around 82% likely to succeed. So when this number is above 50, you're actually not going to dodge as much as you think you should. Evade plus 10 will lower the displayed 70 hit to a displayed 60 hit, but when the game says a 60% hit rate, it actually means the enemy only has a 68% chance to hit. Now hold on a second, let's do some quick math. 82% minus 68%. That's actually a 14-point difference. So Lonku's Evade plus 10 skill is actually giving him 14 evasion in this situation, even though it says it only gives 10. So here's where the breaker skills really shine. The example we gave above, dropping an enemy hit rate from 80 to 30 displayed, is actually changing their hit chance from an insanely consistent 92% chance to hit you all the way down to a super unlikely 18% chance to hit you. Even though the breaker skill says that it gives a minus 50 penalty to the enemy, you're actually reducing their true chance of hitting you by 74%. This is a massive swing, and the breaker skills provide so much value, especially because with speed, luck, outdoor fighter, Tantivy, evade plus 10, and other factors, it can be very reasonable to drop the enemy evade so low that they are almost guaranteed to miss you. And that brings us to the third point of the breaker skills. If the enemy has a small chance of hitting you, the breaker skill will make it impossible for that enemy to ever hit you. So if an enemy has a 40% displayed hit chance against you, this normally isn't super likely to hit, sure, but with a sword breaker, you turn that into a 0% hit chance. In Fire Emblem Awakening, you can use this to make dodge tanking into a completely reliable, 100% consistent strategy. You can make it impossible for specific enemies to hit your dodge tanks, and they will still attack you. Funny enough, it's even possible to use Lancebreaker against the final secret boss of Apotheosis, and during the main campaign, Lonku, Frederick, Church, and several other characters can reasonably dodge tank through a lot of common enemies. If you are planning to use Frederick in the long term, it can be a very good idea to get him into Wyvern Lord for Swordbreaker or Griffin Rider for Lancebreaker. I'm not sure which of these two skills I favor, and there's a good argument for both of them. I personally think Axebreaker is probably the best breaker skill, but I think that's just my personal preference. Genuinely, every breaker skill is very good in this game, and they all have an argument for best use cases. You can even use Bowbreaker to effectively remove your flying weakness on certain characters. On that note, however, let's get back to the topic of enemy phase recovery. We need to talk about Hero. Some of your best options for primary tanks are going to be units with access to the Hero class. Simply put, this class was designed for enemy phase sweeping. Heroes have great physical bulk, naturally high speed, meaning they're going to be able to soak a lot of attacks and avoid getting doubled, or they're going to even reliably double enemies while sweeping. Most importantly, they get access to both Sol and Axe Breaker. We already talked about why breaker skills are good, so let's talk about why Sol is so important. The more layers of RNG you have on your enemy phase sweeper, the safer they are going to be. It can be difficult to create a unit that is truly immune to every type of enemy, especially on Lunatic Plus. There is one build that is more consistent than a Sol Tanking hero, but the Sol Tanking hero is pretty much the next best thing we've got, and it's a little bit more available. The way Sol works is that you have a chance to recover half of the damage you deal to the enemy. This chance is based on your skill stat, which is great because heroes also have high skill. The chance is going to be around 20 or 30% early on, but you could reasonably increase this all the way up to a 50% chance later. Let's look at a hypothetical situation that's actually not very likely to happen. You're sweeping through an enemy group, and every single enemy hits you for full damage. Maybe you don't have enough HP and defense to take all of these attacks. However, Awakening isn't really that kind of game. So, in a real situation, you're going to dodge some attacks, you're going to dual guard some attacks, and by adding Sol into the mix on top of that, you're also going to heal yourself in between some of the enemy attacks. By adding a third layer of RNG, you can create situations where it's statistically even more improbable that your Sol tank could ever actually die. In some cases, I don't even bother to calculate the enemy stats. You can tell just by glancing at the combat forecast. If the situation requires 9 people to all hit me in a row, with some of them having single-digit hit rates, and for Sol to never activate when I have 18 chances to activate it, you know what? If that's the only way my character can die, then I'm pretty comfortable taking that risk. I'm just going to throw them in there. Now, obviously, if you see a situation where you have to fight like 4 enemies, and if only one of them hits you, you're going to die, then that's not a risk worth taking. On that note, your Sol tanks are going to feel a little bit underwhelming early on when you first promote them, but as they continue to level and gain stats, they're going to feel more and more indestructible. Getting Axebreaker at level 15 just makes it so the hardest hitting enemies are even less likely to hit you, maybe even incapable of hitting you in many cases. And this is where your soul tank and consistency is going to start to see a massive spike in power. In my opinion, a single good soul tank can carry you completely through Lunatic mode. However, in Lunatic Plus, enemy compositions are a lot more scary because of dangerous enemy skills like Luna, Counter, and Hawkeye. On that note, I want to say something. Some people think the breaker skills or dodging strats in general are less good on Lunatic Plus because of Hawkeye, but this isn't really true, because there's going to be plenty of enemies who do not have Hawkeye, and you can still dodge those attacks. So just factor the guaranteed damage from Hawkeye into your calculations, and then see what your combat looks like against the enemies without Hawkeye. I guarantee you that having higher evasion is never going to hurt you more than it helps you. It can only help you. So now let's talk about the candidates for good soul tanking units, because on Lunatic Plus, you're going to want 2 tanks. Vaike is the prime example, and I will definitely use him on my optimized team that I'm planning to build right now, but he falls into a weird space where he feels like both a low investment and a high investment unit at the same time. So let's talk about his low investment qualities first. His stats are quite impressive at base. He has good combat against many of the enemies you're going to face early on, and a good pair-up partner can often help fix his combat against anything else. At worst, you could just pair up Vaike with another unit to give them more strength and defense, so it's never a bad thing to deploy him. Furthermore, he promotes directly from fighter into hero. Then, after he's done with the hero line, he can go into warrior or berserker. Axes are way more important than swords. Berserker is more focused and more offensively deadly, with high speed, strength, and a natural bonus to their crit rate, and eventually getting access to axe fare for even more damage. Warrior, I think, is a bit more of a finesse pick for more experienced players. I certainly prefer Warrior on Lunatic Plus for a few reasons. Well, actually, it's just because they have access to bows, but the expanded explanation is that bow access is good for several reasons. Number 1, not only does it give Vaike an option for 2-range chip damage and effective chip damage against flyers, or effective lethal damage against flyers, keep in mind that many bows have high attack power and they will deal more damage than the hand axe. But more importantly, on Lunatic Plus, having a bow equipped will make it so that Vaike can't deal counter damage to himself because he's incapable of fighting at 1 range. Yeah, this is a weird game where locking yourself to 2-range combat is actually a good thing rather than a bad thing. And the fact that he can switch between melee, 1 to 2 range, or intentionally 2-range lock himself with bows, this just gives the warrior class a ton of versatility for playing around Lunatic Plus nonsense, as long as you're an experienced player and you know what you're doing. Either way, you definitely want and need to go through hero first, because soul is an essential part of his kit. Now, the reason why I say Vaike is somewhat high investment is this. If you are solely focusing on training Vaike, he will become very strong, very fast. However, if you're raising him up as a member of a bigger team, he's only going to have access to a portion of this overall experience. Splitting up your experience between different characters in this game yields pretty great results, because characters tend to gain less experience when they're over-leveled anyway, so keeping units close to the level curve of enemies means they're going to be gaining more experience per combat, which is more efficient. The issue here is in the difference between a normal investment Vaike and a hyper investment Vaike. It's minor, but it is notable. When he initially promotes to hero, his combat is still not going to be perfect quite yet, and it'll take a few levels before he truly starts to feel unkillable. And that's not something that's going to break his viability as a unit. He's still probably the best soul tank around, but he certainly requires a level of investment that you need to consider early on. If you want to use Vaike as one of your primary tanks, there are many reasons to do so, but you must decide to do this right away and begin training him right away, and that itself is a high investment. And even still, there's going to be a moment where you're going to feel like, was this worth it? Because Vaike is still struggling. But don't worry, if you stick it out, he will get strong around level 3 or 4 hero, and after that you get soul, and things are just uphill from there, because after that he gets Axebreaker and he becomes even better. Now, if you don't want to train Vaike, if you mess things up and you're unable to do it, or you just missed your chance and you're a bit further in the game, you will get Gregor. If Vaike was around level 10 at the point where Gregor joins, they're about equal in performance to Gregor, they just have some minor differences in their combat, and especially because of their different weapon focus, they have slightly different overall roles, axe versus sword. But this is a level of nuance we don't really need to get into for this guide. The big thing to keep in mind is that if you were training Vaike, he's going to be above level 10 at the point where Gregor joins, and that's crucial to keep in mind. This is the weakness of Gregor. Gregor is a solid low investment unit. He's a true low investment unit. All you need to do is use a Master Seal on him right away as soon as he joins, and then basically continue to use him in the way that you would have been using Vaike if you trained Vaike. But his weakness, Gregor's weakness, is that if you did train Vaike, then Vaike has already surpassed him by this point. And this means that both in the short term and by extension in the long term, Vaike is always going to be slightly ahead of Gregor. Because you're never going to use both Gregor and Vaike, or in my opinion, you never should, I typically think about which one I would prefer to use. And it often comes down to whether or not I have enough early experience to feed Vaike, or if I have to use that for other characters, or if I have to use my other Master Seals for other characters. The worst thing you can do with Gregor is to not promote him right away. I made this mistake in the past and I suffered for it. If you have Gregor just hanging around as a level 10 mercenary for a while, even if you level him up for a few times and then promote him later on, he's typically going to be left behind in stats. He's going to fall into that underwhelming valley where Vaike was sitting around chapter 7 or 8, but the problem is that it's already way too late for him to make up for it. By the time you get him up to a level 4 or level 5 hero, he's just too far behind again. He feels like he's lagging behind with the enemies and he wants to be level 10 or level 15, and it's so tough to get him back up to speed. It ends up feeling like you wasted that Master Seal, which is why I say if you can't invest into Gregor right away, you might as well just bench him and go with something or someone else for this role. On that note, we have to talk about Robin. Because Robin has access to every class, this means they do have access to Fighter and Mercenary, and they can promote into Hero from either of those lines. The issue is they don't match up against Vaike or Gregor very well for either comparison. Robin joins very early on and has a ton of uncontested experience. Leveling them up to level 10 and then switching them to a class that can promote into Hero is quite easy to do, but it has several benefits and several pitfalls. So first of all, you end up losing your access to tomes, and losing one of your tome users early on can actually make things a lot more tricky in the early game. Also, at some point in the game, you're going to be stuck training with E-rank weapons, needing to grind to D-rank in axes so that you can hold a hand axe, or C-rank in swords for the Levin sword is not that great. And all of this, honestly, is not too big of an issue on its own, and it's really not even an issue. You could absolutely do this build, I've used it many times, but it is very, very high investment. Out of the three options we discussed, Robin is the highest investment to get into a soul tank. You need a second seal to switch them from Fighter or Mercenary, you need a Master Seal to promote them, you need a ton of experience, way more than Vaike and Gregor need for the hero promotion. Veteran does help offset this, but it does not help with weapon experience. And again, you need a ton of combats in the early game that Robin has to steal from other characters to get all of this weapon experience. You have to consider if all of this investment is really worth it, or if Robin is just good enough without needing to use Soul. That's because Robin also has access to Dark Mage, which allows them to keep their tome access, and allows them to use one of the best enemy phase recovery tools other than Soul. But before we talk about that, I need to discuss the other potential options for the Soul tank in the long term. Gaius is probably not the first character who comes to mind when he joins, and truthfully, he's more of a utility pick than a primary carry. But like Lon'qu, his stats are surprisingly good when he joins. He also has only a few levels to go to reach level 10, at which point he can either switch to a fighter or promote directly into an assassin. Training him through the fighter line would be a pain, but it allows him to promote directly into hero and get soul earlier. Otherwise, it's pretty fine to just train him as an assassin and then switch him over to a hero later on. Now, you might be wondering, what's the point of doing all of this? Surely Gaius cannot be as tanky as Vaike, Robin, or Gregor. And that's actually true. I don't think he's anywhere near the best option for this, but I do think he is just good enough to be viable, if you're willing to invest the effort and resources into making him work. Maybe you could go through Trickster and get him lucky 7, and then switch him over to a soul tank, for very good dodge tanking combined with enemy phase recovery. Most importantly though, Gaius has one unique trait that the other 3 do not have. He starts as a thief. He's going to have Lock Touch, and he's going to have Move +1. Move +1 is great on any unit, and Lock Touch is pretty important to have. So the one thing Gaius offers is the utility of combining your Lock Touch character with your Soul character. Remember, we're going to have limited deployment slots in the later chapters. Being able to field your Soul tank without needing to bench somebody else, because you already have your Lock Touch unit in the same slot, does have value. This leaves more spaces for more rescue staff users. Now, unfortunately, Anna is such a good unit, and she comes with Lock Touch for free, that this probably isn't a huge deal, but still, Gaius has access to Soul, which Anna does not, so he does something slightly different, and it's at least worth a mention. It's not something you're going to do on an optimized team, but it is something you can do on your team if you have a creative idea that you want to try out. Cordelia, as a long-term project unit, has the absolutely insane ability to grab Galeforce, Sol, and have Dark Mage access with Nosferatu. This genuinely puts her on the same tier of power as a character like female Robin, at least in terms of class access. They are pretty much the only two Generation 1 characters who have Galeforce, Sol, and Dark Mage. And unlike female Robin, Cordelia doesn't need to waste a second seal to make her into a Pegasus, and she doesn't need to train out of E-rank lances, she just starts there. Now unfortunately, getting Galeforce is better on an attacking role, and getting Sol or Nosferatu is better on a tanking role. So she does have a slight case of unit identity confusion. I mean, this isn't really going to undercut her value, it basically just means she can do either of the top tier roles, and she can do them really well, but it also just means trying to get her to do everything is not usually the way to go. I personally prefer to use Cordelia for using one thing or the other, and actually what I really like is using her as a Falcon Knight. But if you're building a team and you want to send Cordelia over to Hero or send her over to Sorcerer, it's probably worth considering because she can very likely shine in that role. Her biggest problem with going directly into Sorcerer is that her innate magic stat is pretty much trash. She will not be hitting hard enough to actually perform very well in this role. It's going to take time for her to gain magic in the Sorcerer class. Basilio and Flavia do join much later on in the game, but both of them serve as true soul tanks that you get genuinely for free. Unlike Gregor, who is only technically free because he still requires a Master Seal and you still need to train him throughout the game, these characters just jump right onto the team and they immediately perform. Of course, the fact that they join so late is a downside because you're not going to be able to use them for most of the game, but if you didn't train a soul tank or if you don't feel like training a soul tank, just remember that you're going to get these two for free later on. Seriously, do not forget about them when planning. They can easily be slotted into any team if you have free space. Basilio even gets access to bows and the awesome rally strength skill at base. Now, let's talk about the unfortunate downside of soul tanking, and the one method that's going to surpass it. Let's have a discussion about luck and RNG. As I mentioned, especially right after you promote and right after you get soul, your heroes are still going to be a little bit vulnerable. If they aren't able to keep up with enemy stat inflation, there's going to be cases where they're relying on soul activations to keep themselves alive, or relying on dodging in order to survive, or needing your heal staff users to heal your soul tank instead of being able to use rescue every turn. And in those situations, at least some of the time, even with a 40% activation rate, you're going to fail to activate soul 6, 7, or even 8 times in a row. It happens. It just happens, and there's nothing you can do about it. Personally speaking, this can be very frustrating around the midpoint of the game, especially with some of the very difficult middle chapters that have very strong promoted enemies. Right at this time, the soul tanks feel like they're not quite cutting it. But as time passes, they will become more consistent and they will be able to overpower enemies later on. Soul activations are going to be less essential and they'll just feel like more of a convenience, and it will trigger more often anyway because your skill stat is going to be getting higher and higher. But in the short term and in the long term, there is a more consistent method that you can rely on rather than needing soul to proc. This weapon is responsible for the extremely derivative meta of Awakening, and it's so powerful that it has practically shaped the entire discussion around Fire Emblem Awakening for 10 years. It was so powerful that it had to be severely nerfed for Fates, and it is still extremely good there. Of course, we're talking about Nosferatu. I highly recommend having at least one Nosferatu tank as one of your primary tanks and enemy face sweepers. It can often be fairly reasonable and very alluring to just forego all of the downsides of using a traditional tank like Frederick or using a soul tank like Vaike and just use 2 Nosferatu tanks. Aside from the guaranteed recovery, there's actually a few reasons why Nosferatu is unquestionably the superior method, even if it does have weaknesses. So, unlike your soul tanks, Vaike, Gregor, and even Robin, you have access to multiple Nosferatu tanks that you get either completely for free or basically as good as free. There's never a decision that you need to make about whether you want to train Vaike or not. Robin kind of falls into that second category anyway as being basically free, because Robin and Muriel, if you do use them early on, they're fantastic targets for the early second seal, and they're going to pick up plenty of experience anyway. You can send them over to Dark Mage and they can keep using tomes the entire time like they've already been doing, and they're gradually going to become more and more defensively strong. On that note, Zarya is a good example. She joins already at level 10, so you don't even need to train another Nosferatu user. Not only does she come with the tome, but she's probably the best option for wielding it. Her defense, magic, and speed are all solid, and as long as you start training her right away, she's going to get more and more comfortable over time, settling into a Nosferatu tanking role. She comes with Hex and Anathema, so she doesn't even need a partner who uses Hex and Anathema for her. Instead, you can just pair her up with any character, depending on which stat you want her to have more of. If you want speed, I highly recommend Trickster Gaius. Henry is going to join a bit later than Zarya, and he's worse at combat, in my opinion, just because his speed is notably worse. However, you shouldn't discount him completely. With a good speed pair-up, he can be a decent Nosferatu tank in his own right. He is better at blocking physical attacks than Zarya, although honestly, you kind of want your Nosferatu tank to be the one who can take on magical attackers. But Henry does come with C rank in tomes, so that counts for something, I guess. I wouldn't discount Henry entirely, but I think he functions better as a support and utility unit, and we're going to talk about that in the next section. So for now, let's just stick to talking about Nosferatu itself, because Nosferatu does have weaknesses, so let's talk about those. The biggest problems are price and availability. First, I want to talk about the price. A hand axe only costs 750 gold for a stack of 25, but a Nosferatu tome costs 980 gold for a smaller stack of only 20 charges. 20 uses is also not very many for an enemy phase sweeper, so later on, when you have access to them, you probably want to be carrying 2 stacks into every single battle, so not only are the individual uses of Nosferatu 63% more expensive than a hand axe, but the game often requires you to buy multiple stacks at a time, which is even more money in the immediate term. The more money you spend on Nosferatu, the less you have for useful tools like Rescue, Physic, extra seals that you might want to buy, that you either bought early on or that you need to buy later. You're going to have less money for weapon forges, for tonics, and for any other things that you need. Dark Mage does have a good way to get around this weakness, and it's more simple than you might expect. Just don't use Nosferatu. I mean, yeah, you should use it when you need to, but on the turns where you don't need it, stick to using a Wind Tome for extremely cheap enemy phase sweeping. This is one of the key value points for all tome users, and if the enemies have a bit more resistance, Dark Mages can use a Forged Flux Tome, which is both cheap, powerful, and cheap to forge. Or if you need even more firepower, just grab one of the higher rank tomes, or forge a higher rank tome for even more attack power. The point being, it can be easy to fall into the trap of keeping Nosferatu equipped all the time, because it feels comfortable and it feels safe, but it's actually better if you keep it in your back pocket and only take it out when absolutely needed. On that note, we have to talk about Nosferatu's availability. You do get a Nosferatu with 20 charges when you recruit Zarya, but after that, you won't be able to buy any more normally until after Chapter 13. Now, this isn't a problem by itself, because honestly, it's quite possible to beat Chapters 1 to 13 without ever using Nosferatu a single time. And so any charges from this stack of 20 that you use, it's more of just a nice bonus that you got it early on. It's not really a mandatory requirement for any strategies. But even still, the selling point of Nosferatu is the consistent enemy phase healing. But on turns when you don't have Nosferatu equipped, your enemy phase healing is actually happening 0% of the time, and that's significantly worse than 100%. To compare them, I think I can use this point to highlight where Sol actually does shine, and it's the one space where Nosferatu is lacking. You see, Sol always has that chance to activate all of the time, no matter what weapon you have equipped. You can spam Sol every turn with your cheap weapons. You can hit enemies with hard-hitting attacks when you need to, and still recover from Sol, and honestly, having a Sol tank available does have value. There is a niche for this style of play that gives you something that Nosferatu doesn't offer, and more importantly, especially early on, when Nosferatu availability is limited, your Sol tank can absolutely serve as an enemy phase sweeper in situations where it's just not viable to burn through 14 charges of Nosferatu in the early game just to get one essential healing action. The counterpoint here is that Sol sometimes activates when you don't need it, so in those situations it might as well not exist, since it's not actually doing anything. And in situations where you do need Sol to activate, it might not activate. So the power of Nosferatu is that you can always turn it on or off when you need to, and this prevents the glaring weakness of Sol. Overall, I tend to prefer having one Sol tank and one Nosferatu tank, so that I can take advantage of their different applications in different situations, but I can definitely see the high power level of bringing 2 Nosferatu tanks with you. Also, keep in mind, there are characters who can get both Sol and Nosferatu. Now, this amount of healing might be overkill, but hey, if you want to do it, it's certainly not going to hurt you. It's not a bad investment, it's just an expensive one, and it's a build that only a few characters can even obtain anyway. Now, I do want to briefly talk about second generations on that point. It can theoretically be possible to give almost any build to almost any second generation character. So by that logic, you could just make the perfect Sol tank, Nosferatu tank, or Sol Nosferatu tank as a Generation 2 unit. And while this is true, keep in mind the child units have fairly limited usage applications in a no grinding context. They're going to join late, and they're going to join underleveled. These child units are not going to help you beat the crucial chapters 2, 3, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, or 13. So you need other characters in the short term who can clear those maps. But if you've already trained 2 primary tanks to deal with Chapter 13, then why bother replacing them with an underleveled unit later on? It just doesn't make any sense. Ultimately, if you want to use Generation 2 units, there are plenty of good reasons to do it. They tend to have more complete builds and higher ceilings that they can reach to give even more consistency in the late game, but you should try to limit the number of characters you're training and make sure that you have a plan in mind, and go into the game with that plan and stick to that plan. If you want to use Severa for a primary tanking build, you need to think about her parents and which skills they're going to pass down, and make sure that you start working on those builds as soon as possible so you can recruit Severa as soon as possible with the skills that she needs. And that brings me to my next point. While the child units are theoretically infinite, the reality is, in a grinding context, they are often limited by the direct promotion lines of their parents. Let's stick with Severa as an example, because she's actually a very strong character, and even she is held back by this. Cordelia could technically get access to Sol, yes, but it's going to require more levels, and it's going to require a second seal, and it's going to require you to have Cordelia lose access to her flight. When Severa joins, she's already in the mercenary class, so there's not really any reason to pass down Sol from Cordelia to Severa. Instead, let's look at an example of what you should be doing. Cordelia could pass down Galeforce, Rally Movement, or Rally Speed, so that Severa can go directly into Hero and she won't have any redundancy. This is actually a point of value. An example of a more limited second generation character is someone like Inigo. Olivia is not reasonably going to pass down anything useful in a no grinding context. There isn't enough time, experience, or viable combats that Olivia is capable of fighting to get Galeforce, so she cannot pass it down to him anyway. But more importantly, when you choose a father from Inigo, you need to pick someone who can access their valuable skills and pass them down quickly. You can't wait until the end of the game when a level 10 Inigo is going to be functionally useless. For example, if you want Beaufair, Virion is a good choice for a father, because Virion promotes directly into Sniper, and he can reach Beaufair quickly with the minimum amount of experience required and pass it down to Inigo as soon as possible. Contrast this with using Stahl as the father. Technically, Stahl can also pass down Beaufair, yes. However, it's going to require you to train him through Cavalier, Paladin, and then Sniper, or Cavalier, Archer, and then Sniper. It's going to take longer, it's going to take more experience before you get Beaufair, and by the time Sol is ready to pass it down, it might already be too late for Inigo to join the game, because he won't have the stats needed to fight against the enemies that are appearing in the chapters that you're currently facing. Most of the Generation 2 units don't really have any inherent problems with these limitations. It's not like Fates, where the characters tend to have the same class as their parents. In Awakening, surprisingly, most of the kids actually have different classes than their parents. But still, it's better to think about what you're doing when you select the father. Again, people sometimes get too caught up in thinking about what Inigo could do theoretically in Apotheosis on an endgame file with hours and hours of DLC grinding. But if we are talking about how to build a team in a no grinding context during a vanilla playthrough, you can seriously struggle if you don't go out of your way to properly set him up for success and think about which parent is going to benefit him immediately, not at the very end of the game. And the same thing can be said about almost every child unit. If you want to use them for any of these roles, whether it be the primary tank that we're discussing now or something else later, you can do it. Just make sure you plan up ahead and come up with something that actually works in a real game. Try using Vaike as a father if you want the child to inherit Sol, because Vaike naturally gets access to Sol very fast. He can pass this valuable skill down to his child right away. The same logic goes for Sumia and Cordelia with Galeforce. Unlike Olivia, they can reach Galeforce and pass it down with the minimum amount of grinding needed. Trying to use Lissa, Maribel, or worst of all Olivia just to pass down Galeforce is a recipe for disaster. These characters don't have time to spend 15 levels in Dark Flyer after training through other class lines first. It only works in a context where you allow grinding. I don't think it's invalid to play the game with grinding. I just think it's less relevant to discussing which strategies are good in a normal play. And honestly, even with limited experience, there are so many valid strategies available to you. The important point is to think about what you're doing so you don't accidentally invest limited resources into a unit, skill, or build that won't yield results that are worth the amount that you spent. I've made this mistake plenty of times myself, so I'm not perfect. Nobody is. And I learn from these mistakes. It takes a bit of experience with the game to learn what works and what doesn't work. This is why I even say it's usually a good idea to do a run with grinding allowed for your first Lunatic Plus run, or even your first Lunatic run, and then you can use that knowledge to help you plan no grinding runs in the future. Oh, also, one more thing regarding traditional tanks like Frederick. I think there isn't anyone else other than Frederick worth considering, so I want to mention that now. The truth is, Frederick has several weaknesses which we already discussed earlier, and they're mostly only offset by the fact that you get him for free at the start of the game. Any character you're going to train to replace Frederick, if you're going out of your way to train them, you should be picking a character that is going to have long-term viability and enemy phase healing. Otherwise, why are you bothering to waste all that time and effort training someone to replace Frederick at all? Anyway, let's say you've already picked your two primary tanks. Hopefully, you have two units who are capable of enemy phase sweeping with a high level of reliability. Now you need to pick two support partners to match up with these two characters. Support partners don't need to be paired up all the time, and it can often be useful to have them unpaired so you have more actions available in a turn. However, you still want to have characters who can, in the situation that requires it, pair up with their S-rank partner to give them the maximum possible stat bonus and the highest chance to dual strike and the highest chance to crit. There are two really good templates that work if you're building a support character. One of them is going to boost the key stats of the primary tank with the pair-up function, while providing hard-hitting dual strikes, hopefully with effective weaponry whenever possible. The other idea is to focus on getting support skills, and then if the character is capable of dual striking, or if they give at least moderately useful stats, we consider that to be good enough. The more they provide, the better, but the barrier for entry here is a lot lower in terms of stats, because with this second type, we're more interested in skills. I want to talk about those skills first, so let's talk about the second type first. Dual Guard Plus is pretty widely available, and it's quite useful for playing around Hawkeye, Luna Plus, and even Counter indirectly. Whenever you Dual Guard, it helps to keep your health high, and this makes it more likely that you will survive reflected damage from Counter. Attacks with Hawkeye can even be blocked with Dual Guard Plus, and this one is particularly good on partners like Kellum and Frederick with very high defense. One of the ways to make Frederick useful in the long term is to switch his role in the mid-game. When he's no longer capable of primary enemy phase tanking, he can still switch over to become the primary support partner for someone like Cordelia, female Robin, or even just one of his male allies with an A support. With the power of Dual Guard Plus and his awesome pair-up bonuses, he will help the survivability of his ally by a lot. Now we have to talk about Hex and Anathema. The fact that both of these skills are learned by Dark Mage, already one of the best classes, is just insane. I honestly tend to build my entire team structure around my Hex and Anathema users if I'm trying to optimize the game, and that says a lot, simply because unlike Dual Guard Plus, access to these skills is relatively more limited. So when we finish picking our 8 characters, 4 of them should have Hex and Anathema. That way each pair has access to the Hex bonus, and each pair has access to the Anathema bonus. Libra and Cordelia can get them, but they're far less likely to do so just because of the weird reclassing that you would need to do. Robin and Muriel can get Hex and Anathema, and it's often a good idea to have them do it, just so that they can pair up with someone else and both get the benefits of Hex and Anathema, and give it to their partner, and give it to other allies. These 2 characters alone already fill up 2 of the 4 characters that I want with Hex and Anathema. For free, you later get Saria and Henry, and that makes 4 out of 4. Saria and Henry both end up being very strong considerations for permanent team members on any roster, just because whoever you pair them up with both for their S support rank and also the person that they need to pair up on this one crucial turn, even if it's not their dedicated partner, is going to be benefiting from Hex and Anathema. And Henry is really good to just stand around on the battlefield and provide a hit bonus and a crit bonus to everyone else. It seems weird, but it's actually really good to have him doing this, even if he's not directly fighting. So what do these skills actually do exactly? Basically, in terms of concept, Hex and Anathema accelerate your offense, and they make your offensive power more consistent. Your attacks are going to be more likely to hit and more likely to crit. Missing attacks is absolutely unacceptable for an enemy phase sweeper in most cases. If you miss an attack, you're leaving enemies alive that you needed to be clearing. This isn't always a problem. Sometimes you have other characters who can clean up on player phase. However, it's better to be able to consistently sweep all enemies, and sometimes it will have devastating consequences if you leave too many enemies alive. Worst of all, when you miss an attack, you aren't getting your enemy phase healing. Sol and Nosferatu only heal you based on the amount of damage you heal. So if you miss, that's bad, and hitting is very important. Enemy phase recovery also has a unique quirk, which makes critical hits more beneficial. You see, you only heal based on the amount of damage that is actually dealt to the enemy. This matters a lot more for Sol users, so I'm going to use them as the example. Let's say you hit an enemy for 40 damage, then you hit the same enemy for 8 damage to finish them off. If Sol triggered on the second hit, you're only going to heal 4 HP instead of the 20 HP that you would have healed off the first hit. But landing a critical hit on the first attack and healing there with Sol or Nosferatu will cause you to deal 48 damage, the enemy's total health pool, and you'll heal yourself for 24. Landing a critical attack and making sure you always one-shot enemies is going to be quite good for your enemy phase healing. Coincidentally, being able to one-shot enemies also helps play around counter. Awakening is a game where you can easily push your crit rate above 50%. So really, don't underestimate the value of Hex and Anathema. You are going to be critting very consistently, and they push this bonus even further. Remember, if you need to hit an enemy twice to kill them, you're likely taking massive counter damage off that first attack. You need to one-shot them, either with direct attacks or with critical hits. This is just another reason why having Hex Anathema support on your primary tanks is so crucial. An easy way to get this benefit would be something like Mage Muriel supporting Fighter Vaike early on. Muriel switches to Dark Mage to get the benefits of Hex and Anathema, and Vaike promotes to Hero so that he can get Sol. Now Vaike is going to be hitting and critting more often. Even though Muriel's bonus to magic doesn't help Vaike at all, the value of this support comes from the skills that she's providing. On that note, Troubadour and Valkyrie line has the remaining very good support skills, Demoiselle and Dual Support Plus. These give defensive bonuses, which can make it so you're less reliant on Sol activations to stay alive, because you'll be dodging more often, and it can even eliminate the small chance of being crit by enemy attacks, which is a massive consistency boost. Get rid of that 5% chance for the enemy to crit you and ruin your day. Actually, on that note, Dual Support Plus is so powerful in particular that it probably needs its own entire paragraph to talk about. Having Dual Support Plus is not quite exactly the same, but just to illustrate my point, it's a little bit like having Indoor Fighter, Outdoor Fighter, Zeal, and Demoiselle all in a single skill slot. And it also gives those benefits not just to yourself, but also to your partner and anyone that you're standing next to, rather than only giving the bonuses to yourself. For a single skill slot, it's absolutely crazy how overlooked this skill is. Unfortunately, though, access to Demoiselle and Dual Support Plus is a little bit limited and a little bit wonky. Troubadour is a pretty easy class to train out of, but only one character starts there, Maribel, and there aren't very many other characters who want to take a detour. Muriel is probably the other good option, and she deserves a shout out here. It's the second time I'm bringing her up, and yes, she is one of the best support partners in the game. I'm actually going to bring her up a third time later on. So believe me, you need to be considering Muriel for one of these roles. You either pair her up with Robin, Vaike, or Henry, and you can turn that character into an enemy phase sweeper. You will see results. For the remaining support skills, there is also Charm and Dual Strike Plus, which are basically exclusive to Chrom and Lucina, and then you have Solidarity, which is basically exclusive to Robin and Morgan. These skills are very good, and they will allow you to slot either Chrom or Robin into a primary support character role, if that's what you want to do. Chrom is straight up the best support character in the game. However, it can be more productive to attach him to an offensive character. The combination of Charm and Dual Strike Plus simply lends itself better to pairing him up with an offensive supporter. Additionally, he does get access to Bowfair and the Sniper class, which is a great support class, and could even transition into Bow Knight later on if his partner needs extra speed or that nice +1 movement. On the subject of Bowfair, this brings us back around to the other type of support partner, the one that is meant to provide stats and dual strikes. Unsurprisingly, Chrom shines in this role too because of the power of Dual Strike Plus. For these characters, on top of the stats that they provide, you really want them to get access to a fair skill. Although it's not a requirement, typically they need to provide something else of immense value if they're not able to use dual strikes with Axe Fair or Bowfair. Frederick and Kellum, we talked about earlier, are very good examples for characters who fit into this category without being able to use Axe Fair or Bowfair. Although they will probably have a Lance equipped and they can't use Lance Fair, they still provide the utility of Dual Guard Plus on top of their awesome stat line. And very importantly, you're often using these characters because of that stat line, rather than for a specific skill. They are the opposite of someone like Saria or Henry. The incredible amount of extra defense and strength that you can get from Kellum and Frederick will be greatly appreciated by Robin when they are enemy face sweeping a large cluster of physical threats. For long-term planning, I think the best option for pure stats are extremely varied. It's not easy for me to say which classes and characters are going to be best. Genuinely, I think there's probably like 8 classes that are all very high tier, and many of the other options are still worth considering because it always depends on your specific needs. If you need a ton of physical defense, General is the obvious choice, but Great Knight gives similar bulk and offense while also providing a clutch +1 movement bonus. That extra mobility might be better than the extra defense, but Warrior is also similarly defensive and it gives even higher strength. Wyvern Lord gives great physical bonuses across the board. And what if you need magical attack? In that case, Sorcerer gives defense, resistance, and magic. Ultimately, when you're choosing your pair-up partner for your enemy phase sweeper, unsurprisingly, the most important thing you need to consider is the enemy phase sweeper, and what do they need? There is no one-size-all-fits answer that can be touted as the best support character in the game, even though I often say it's Chrom. Even Chrom, who is arguably the strongest support character, lacks here. He can only pair up with a few specific characters at his highest potential, and even then, his class set is relatively limited. He wouldn't do a good job of supporting someone like Miriel, even if he was able to S-support with her, which he can't. I'm going to try to give more specific examples of characters and pairings that work as we go through this video, but there's always going to be a certain amount of subjectivity, nuance, and free thinking involved. This is the aspect of team building where you have the freedom to get really, really creative, and I encourage you to do so. I don't want to just tell you what to do. Next though, let's talk about our offensive characters. For player phase removal, there is one major consideration. Can this character get access to Galeforce? Can they get it conveniently? And are they someone who can actually utilize it? Now keep in mind, this is not make or break. I'm going to discuss plenty of examples who can work well without Galeforce. However, like with a Nosferatu tank, the dominant power of Galeforce, the ability for one unit to commit 2 actions, opens up so many new strategies that are otherwise impossible, and it defines the meta. I strongly suggest having at least 1 Galeforce user in your final army. Having 3 is viable. To that end, let's first talk about the potential Galeforce users. All of the same things I said about Generation 2 for primary tanking also apply here. Most of the child units will join very late, and using them to replace a character who is already trained is usually not that great of an idea, especially because many of them don't even have a parent who can pass down Galeforce in any way that makes sense in a no-grinding context. The major exceptions here are Severa, Lucina, and by extension, Cynthia. If you want to invest heavily into Sumia early on, she can learn Galeforce before the end of Chapter 13. This is going to allow Lucina to inherit it, and it will also allow Cynthia to pick up Galeforce and start with it later on when you recruit her. It is a great value to get 3 Galeforce units for the price of training just 1. And yes, you can do this with Robin, Lucina, and Morgan by pairing Robin with Chrom. Lucina, Cynthia, and Sumia will struggle a bit with their offensive power, and often require a good offensive support partner to help ensure they can land Galeforce kills consistently. Robin suffers a lot less from this issue because they are more offensively strong than Sumia, and they're just going to tend to gain more levels, so they're going to have even higher stats. And this is one advantage that Robin's children are also going to have over Sumia's children. Anyway, let's look at the first generation characters. Aside from Sumia, we have Cordelia as our other direct option. Because she starts in Pegasus Knight and she's already leveled, she can be quite appealing. She is one of the best support partners for Frederick, Robin, and probably even several other characters. Even if you have her go on her own and give her a partner like Henry, Libra, they can often boost her viability more as a player phase removal tool. Interestingly, I think Cordelia works better if you send her directly into Falcon Knight first to get rally speed and lance fare and train her for free by spamming heal stabs, and then later on, if you really want to, you can send her over to Dark Flyer to eventually get Galeforce when she's already a combat powerhouse. This works for two reasons. First, there's no time limit. Sumia has to worry about when Lucina is going to join the game at a mandatory point in time if you're pairing her up with Chrom. Even Robin needs to do this if you're pairing her up with Chrom. But Cordelia is different. She can take her time and focus on training herself first and worry about Severa at any point in the game later, because Severa's join time is triggered when you decide to do it. The second thing is staff access. Not only does this provide immediate utility, but it's a free way to train Cordelia, which does not take away experience from any other characters, and it doesn't get slowed down based on the enemy level curve. Whenever Cordelia uses a staff, she always gains the same amount of experience. So even after she becomes over-leveled, she's going to continue to gain a ton of levels at a shockingly fast rate just by spamming stabs. Not only are you going to get lance fare faster than you might expect, but more importantly, when you switch over to Dark Flyer, you're now going to be leveling at a fairly fast rate because you're still just a 10-15-1 Dark Flyer. You're going up against promoted high-level enemies, and the path to Galeforce is not going to take as long as you might imagine either. If you use Robin or Sumia without pairing them up with Chrom, or you just don't care about Lucina, you're going to have this same flexibility. And of course, if you want Galeforce as soon as possible, you can also promote Cordelia directly into Dark Flyer instead of Falcon Knight. That's your choice. But really, I'm not trying to get lost in the details here. What I want to stress is that Cordelia is a great player phase removal unit either way. She's fast enough, she's strong enough, and she has access to the Beast Killer. Effective weaponry is one of the most important attributes of a player phase removal character, and being able to fly helps a lot too, because it allows her to get anywhere that she wants to go. I recently came to really love the Cordelia and Frederick pair-up. It does lack Hex and Anathema, but it allows Frederick to give strength, defense, and even a tiny bit of speed to this flying Falcon Knight. It helps her hit the benchmarks so that she can one-shot enemies with the Beast Killer, and he even provides her with Dual Guard Plus. Cordelia does have a fast support with Libra, and he's a strong pre-promote that you're going to recruit relatively early on. He's also a potential Hex and Anathema user. You will need to reclass him into Dark Mage in order for Cordelia to receive this benefit, which means you'll be losing access to a very powerful staff user. You're giving up a lot for these two aura skills, and even me, as someone who loves Hex and Anathema, feels pretty uncertain about this option. Still, if you want to try it, I say go ahead. It gives Cordelia a boosted crit rate, and that's never a bad thing. Though, to be honest, War Cleric already has fantastic combat, and it gives good parent bonuses, so yeah, it might be best to stick with War Cleric. Aside from direct promotions, we have a few other options. Lissa, Maribel, Sayuri, and sort of Olivia. Listen, I'm not going to talk about Olivia as a real unit for the same reason that I don't talk about Donnell. People in chat do love to tease me about my hatred for Donnell, and maybe at some point in the future I will make a Donnell emblem video just to give the people what they want. But we have to get real here. Outside of a no grinding context, these characters are just going to be your dancer and nothing else, or in the case of Donnell, I just throw him into the enemies and use him as bait. Sayuri is a late joiner, but she can theoretically switch over to Dark Flyer and eventually get access to Galeforce. Her biggest weakness is the same as Anna. She doesn't really have supports to fit well into a team unless you're specifically supporting her with Robin, and in my opinion, she's not as good as Anna to be worth fielding without supports. Lissa and Maribel are able to access the Pegasus line, but all three of these options have the same thing in common. You're going to get the skill later rather than sooner, and that's okay. You can plan around that. Especially in the case of Lissa, who I think is the best example of a late-time Galeforce user, and I'm going to use as the example here. With Lissa, it's typically a better idea to promote her directly into Sage early on. Don't fall into the trap of reclassing her into Pegasus Knight. The only thing you get out of this is speed +2 and relief, and she is awful in that class. and you're losing access to a staff user and a good tome user. Instead, what you should do is go into Sage and make the best use of the things that Lissa is already good at right now. When she reaches level 15 in Sage, she'll get Tome Fair. With Tome Fair, you can now reclass into Dark Falcon, and here, her combat is actually going to be pretty good. She never loses access to tomes, and on the way, she's benefited from a lot of levels, with staff leveling for free, fast experience, very similar to what we talked about with Cordelia. And because she already has that tome rank, because she has high magic, because she has Tome Fair, she's not going to have any problem getting kills, both in order to gain levels so that she can unlock Galeforce, and after she unlocks Galeforce, she'll be able to trigger it very consistently. Again, this is just like we talked about with Cordelia. It's better to save this for later and get it when Lissa is already a strong combat unit, rather than putting the horse before the carrot and trying to train a weak unit to painfully get Galeforce while they're unable to even make the best use of it. Just make a strong unit first, and then get them Galeforce later. Maribel's line to Galeforce can be similar to Lissa, although if she wants Tome Fair, it ends up being less direct, and in a no-grinding context, she's probably not ever going to get it, unless you want to send her to a Dark Falcon as soon as you possibly can. Now, having discussed all these options, I also want to stress the point that enemy removal tools do not need to have Galeforce. It certainly is a nice bonus, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the ability to remove a dangerous threat. Or failing that, in many cases, you just need to weaken them significantly enough that they won't be able to trigger counter. A good example of a solid player phase removal character is the way that you use Frederick early on to one-shot enemies with counter, or to get rid of dangerous enemies. It just happens to be that he can also enemy phase sweep. But later on, you could build someone like Lanku for this role. He has speed and he has good enough offensive stats. He'll pretty much always double enemies. Early on, he's going to come with a killing edge, which will allow him to sometimes secure kills when he lands critical hits. And for the rest of the game, he's going to be using these crit-driven weapons more and more and more. His base crit rate will raise to insane levels, and then you can pair him up with someone like Muriel or Saria, who can provide him with Hex and Anathema. In the Assassin line, he also gets access to Lethality, which has a lot more of a use case than you might be giving it credit for. People dislike it because of the low activation rate, but the thing is, it's just a fourth additional layer of RNG that can turn things in your favor, and it directly plays around counter, Aegis, and Pavis, not to mention the fact that Astra is virtually unusable in Lunatic Plus. Hitting yourself with counter damage 5 times in a row is untenable. However, on the subject of Swordmaster, Lanku can get access to Swordfair. This boosts his damage even further, which makes him even more consistent at enemy phase removal. Unfortunately, he doesn't get Bowfair, which is a little bit sad, because I think Assassin is his best class, and he is a very good bow user. Interestingly, Lanku can also make a good Wyvern Lord later on, if you really want to plan for the long term with him. Remember how we talked about how Evade plus 10 is really good when I was explaining how Evasion works, but then I also started talking about the Wyvern class skills like Swordbreaker, Lancebreaker, and Quick Burn, which can boost your dodge tanking strats to the next level? Well, Lanku has Evade plus 10, and he can go into the Wyvern line, so they clearly knew what they were doing with this character when they designed him. He has access to most of the best dodging skills in the game, including Lucky 7. Lanku is one of those characters who can serve as a switch unit. He can be a player phase removal tool, but in a pinch, you can also use him as a dodge tanking unit, and he performs reasonably well there too. Not to mention, his offensive output is typically going to be great when he's enemy phase sweeping. He hits a lot harder than most of the natural Galeforce users. Remember that you can also grab Lanku with a rescue staff and pull him back to safety after he's removed a dangerous threat. So it doesn't really matter that he doesn't have Galeforce, because you can simulate this by using a rescue staff anyway. This applies to someone like Virion too. If you train him, he'll be able to hit very hard and likely one-shot dangerous enemy flyers, and being able to snipe from 3 tiles away with the longbow has utility purposes for player phase removal. But the reason Galeforce is so good is because it allows you to manually reposition yourself without needing to use rescue staff charges, or even more significantly, allows you to leapfrog deep into enemy territory and remove 2 enemies instead of removing only a single enemy, and then you can still pull them back out with the rescue staff. Take all of the good things I said about the rescue staff earlier, and now apply them to a unit who can essentially rescue themselves out of harm's way, or attack twice, without ever needing to buy more rescue staff charges. There are limitations to Galeforce that make it, in my opinion, not as universally broken or powerful of a tool as the rescue staff, but still it's the best zero-cost tool that you can use on a given turn, and it can be combined with rescue to even greater effect. Rickon, Virion, Miriel are good player phase removal units to varying extents. I think Miriel is the best of the bunch here because she's the fastest, and because she provides Hex and Anathema to herself. She doesn't need a specific pair-up partner, like Henry or Robin, which frees up Henry or Robin to pair up with other characters. For your offensive pair-ups, I think getting Hex and Anathema onto them or their partner is a lot more important, while getting access to Demoiselle and Dual Guard Plus is a little bit less important, because those are better for your sweepers. Getting Dual Strike Plus, Solidarity, Dual Support Plus, or the Fair skills onto the main unit or even the support unit is valuable, but understandably, in some cases, access to those skills is limited. Remember, in a no-grinding context, you have a list of, the perfect skills that you would really love to have, but decisions need to be made, and you have a limited amount of skills that you can actually learn. I think for this reason, offensive builds actually kind of shine in Generation 2, and very recently, my opinion on them has started to turn around, because of your ability to mix and match class sets from two different parents. Most of the Generation 1 class sets feel at least a little bit incomplete, but Generation 2 gives you the option to create a complete class set that works for you. You can also significantly pass down Galeforce to many of the child units, although it does require that strict planning that we talked about earlier. If you are going to do this, the planning and EXP distribution, especially in a no-grinding context, is going to be even more strict. But it's not impossible, and it can be worth it, as long as you pick just like one or two really good child units to fit into one of these roles. Especially because many of the Generation 2 units, aside from Lucina, you do have a little bit of time before you need to pass down your skills. Just remember, if you wait too long, the newly recruited child unit might be completely outclassed by the enemies in your current game. So there is a balance between free time and urgency. You can't recruit them too soon, but you can't recruit them too late. After you have two good player phase attackers and two good enemy phase sweepers, and you've picked out 4 good support partners for those 4 characters, we have 4 spaces remaining to create a roster of 12 units. Truthfully, the remaining spots are going to be a bit easier to fill, and likely won't require as much discussion. Olivia, as mentioned several times now, is basically mandatory. If you're doing full team-based play, her value shoots up exponentially, and the value of a dancer is already quite high in any Fire Emblem game. Her main role on the battlefield will be dancing for your rescue staff users so that they can cast rescue an additional time each turn. In a way, she indirectly functions as an extra rescue staff user that you wish you could fit onto your team. However, there will be times when you either dance for someone else and then rescue Olivia to safety, or if you're lucky or really smart, you can dance for a character and then leave Olivia in a place where she's completely safe. I suppose that would be ideal, but it doesn't always work out that way. Another fun thing you can do is, if a unit fails to trigger Galeforce, you can rescue them back and then have Olivia dance for them. This gives them a second chance to run out and trigger Galeforce, and then still take a third action for the turn after Galeforce triggers. Now, regarding staff users, I mentioned before that I like to have 2, 3, or even more in my party. Now, there is something important that I want to talk about because there's an important distinction here. It has to do with action economy. It is possible for Cordelia to use a staff. It is possible for Lissa to use a staff. But later in the game, they can't serve as a primary rescue staff user if they're busy doing something else every single turn. So, for example, Lissa could be a primary staff user early on, but later, if she's removing enemies every turn, she can't be using rescue. Let's look at Cordelia, because she's also a very straightforward example. Imagine Cordelia spends all of her time paired up with Frederick. She's either giving him speed, or she's dual striking for him, or she's using his strength and his defense to attack enemies herself, while baiting in dual strikes from Frederick. They're fighting together on the front lines, but this means that Cordelia can't always be available to use a rescue staff. She does have utility and value in that she can do it when she needs to, but we're looking for characters in these last 4 spots who can use rescue, physic, or mend every single turn. Lissa is much easier to keep in the back as a full-time rescue user. However, if you do this, her pair-up partner is not benefiting from the value that you get from Lissa, and it removes your ability to use her as a full-time player phase removal tool, which she can be quite good at. Lissa can double up and cover both of these roles, but you have to be aware that the more active Lissa becomes as a combatant, the more important it's going to be to bring in another staff user to take up that spot. Someone who can use heal, mend, rescue, or physic every single turn, and doesn't ever really want or need to be doing anything else. The easy full-time staff users are number 1, Lissa. If you're not drafting her as one of your main 8, then just use her as a primary staff user. Miriel, if you decide to reclass her as a Troubadour support character, can serve as a mostly full-time staff user. Mirabelle gets to do the Troubadour thing for free. However, if she's doing primary staff utility, you probably can't have her as a permanent parrot partner for someone else, which means that you have a character losing out on the benefits of Demoiselle and Dual Support Plus. Strangely enough, even Mirabelle being the best of these 3 really shows how these 3 aren't going to be filler units. They're often going to be main units. You can see how staff access becomes more of a puzzle, and it becomes more and more difficult to solve this puzzle than it initially seemed on the surface. On the surface, you would think, hey, Lissa, Mirabelle, those can be my 2 staff users, but realistically, that doesn't work. A lot of these characters, you reasonably want to use them for an active role on the team, so then you need other characters to fill up these extra staff user roles. One way I made really good use of Lissa in my current playthrough is by pairing her up with Henry. This means she always has a combat support Henry who is near her at all times, and the 2 of them can pair up together and attack to remove an enemy if I need them to. But for the most part, this Lissa remains unpaired in the back, and she spams the rescue staff as much as possible. Even better is that when Henry is paired or unpaired with Lissa, he can still intentionally be positioned to give anathema support to other units on the field. But now we need to talk about Anna and Libra. These 2 are the easiest and most convenient, and arguably the most effective units for the staff filler role. They join with a high magic stat, they already have access to stabs right away, and there's no real opportunity cost. Neither one of them is good as a player phase sweeper, or a primary player phase removal tool, and neither one of them is reasonably giving Hex, Anathema, Demoiselle, Dual Support Plus, Dual Guard Plus, or anything like that to their partners. So because they're not going to be doing one of the main 8 roles, they can be slotted as extra staff users. Anna, I think, exemplifies this role even more than Libra. I talked about how her limited support list is a weakness, but it's precisely because of her limited support list that there's no downside to using her as a filler unit. There's not particularly anyone other than Robin who can really benefit from having Anna as a permanent support partner. So having her hang around in the back, unpaired all the time, and just waiting to use a rescue staff whenever she needs to is actually a great use of her. And the best thing is that she can still pair up with someone to give them speed and magic if she needs to. She can hit enemies really hard with the Levin Sword, usually doubling them for crazy damage, and she provides lock touch utility without needing to remove another character from your team on maps with treasure chests. There are a few alternate staff users who might be better in this role than you'd guess, just because, remember, we're using them as filler. The first is Kellum. He provides great support and defensive utility to the party in the early game. Then, if you want to keep him around permanently, you can reclass him into Priest. His biggest weakness is going to be the short range on his rescue staff, but by spamming heal, mend, and even short range rescues, he can level up surprisingly fast because of how staff experience works, and then he gets access to War Cleric. He's going to become a functionally more bulky version of Libra, and having a second Libra is not a bad thing at all, because Libra is a top-tier character. Gaius also can be promoted to somewhat replicate the ability of Anna by promoting him directly into Trickster. They both provide a very specific value, by combining Lock Touch and Staff User into a single character slot. Unfortunately, like with Kellum, the big weakness of Gaius is that his rescue range is going to be notably worse than Anna. In fact, Anna's stats are impossibly good. Let's talk about these for a second. There's not any character that you could raise in this game to actually have the stats that Anna has. So, honestly, yeah, there's nothing you can say here. Gaius certainly works, especially if your roster space is extremely limited. If you can't deploy Anna because you want to pair Gaius up with someone, because you're trying to unlock more Generation 2 paralogs, for example, he could serve as one of your primary staff users. I also wouldn't completely discount Church in this role. It is absolutely not the best use of her talents, and you are giving up a bit of combat and flyer utility by sending her down through Cleric or Troubadour. However, in the long term, this ability to raise yourself up just by using staff experience ends up being relevant time and time again. We've talked about it over and over again with other characters. Getting her back up to level 10 in Troubadour is actually not that difficult, simply because she constantly gains unrestricted experience with no penalty for overleveling and no need to engage in combat. If you're not planning to use Church as one of your 8 primary units, then you could seriously consider making her into a Troubadour instead. Is her staff range going to be short? Yeah, sure, but we've already discussed why having a short staff range isn't the end of the world. We've talked about why Demoiselle is good, and at the end of the day, she can later go into War Cleric and regain access to her favorite weapon type, axes, while continuing to provide staff utility. As a filler unit, as your 11th or 12th unit, she's pretty good. Lonku and Pan can also play the trickster role if you need them to, although Pan has to jump through significantly more hoops to get there. I know that a lot of these examples don't sound like the most optimal builds in the game, or the best way to use these specific characters. But remember, our goal here isn't to build the strongest possible units. We've already filled our first 8 spots with our primary characters. These are the ones who are going to be doing all the fighting, securing objectives, and even doing secondary and even tertiary tasks. Those 8 characters are the ones who need optimized builds. Now, we're at the bottom of the list. What we're talking about are filling the remaining 3 or 4 deployment slots with characters whose only function is that they need to be able to hold a staff. That's it. If Lissa and Maribel and Muriel are doing more important things on the team already, it can be worth considering sending a crappy staff user into battle for your 12th character slot instead of leaving that space empty and having no staff user. Having said all of that, aside from staff users, there's one other type of character which can be used to fill the remaining slots, and it's another moderately powerful role, although it typically doesn't often apply until much later in the game. That's of course going to be your rally characters. Looking over the list, there is a surprisingly small number of early joining characters who have fast access to useful rallies, and many of them have already appeared on this list earlier, so they're typically going to be busy as primary combat or primary support characters. Part of this just has to do with the fact that about half of the useful rallies are locked behind class lines that aren't really efficient to go through. Typically, when you're putting a character into this rallying role, you have to remove them from another role, because you're hurting their long-term viability as a combat or even a support unit. The main exception here is Cordelia. She does very well in Falcon Knight as a primary attacker, but the problem is that if she's attacking every turn, she's not using rally speed on the turns when she's attacking. Rally spectrum is pretty deep in the Grandmaster line, and there are so many better things Robin can be doing, both in terms of reclassing them way before they'd ever reach 15 Grandmaster, but also in the sense that they'd be taking other actions every turn, rather than using rally spectrum. Rally defense is a little bit less significant than the offensive rallies, and it's also difficult to access with any character who isn't Kellum. Arguably, even Kellum doesn't have a fun time getting this skill. Even though he can promote directly into General, getting Kellum to level 10 in Knight quickly is hard enough. Finding a way to get him 5 more levels worth of experience as a General, yeah, by the time you've done all of that, the extra 4 points of defense have likely fallen off in significance greatly. It's not nothing, but I think it's probably too difficult to be worth the needed experience. Rally strength would be moderately impressive, but the biggest issue is that it's mostly only available to Vaike early on. And if you're going out of your way to train Vaike, then you're going to be sending him into Hero, because the amount of training you invest into him can pay off as having one of the best combat units in the game. And sending him down a different path to make him a support unit after investing that much experience makes very little sense. Having said that, rally strength is something that several characters can pick up later on, or Basilio, for example, just joins with it for free, so don't be afraid to deploy Basilio or someone else to use rally strength for the rest of your team in the final few chapters, once you have those extra deployment slots left over. Rally skill isn't the most significant bonus, but it's moderately easy to obtain with Virion, and if you do end up getting him to level 10 fast enough, it's usually worth keeping him around anyway. It's arguable whether or not he'd be better in Sniper, and honestly I don't see myself wasting a deployment slot on him just to have him sitting around using Rally skill, but it's still worth considering. As you can see though, in a no grinding context, most of these are simply too far out of the way to actually obtain, or they're only available on specific characters who aren't really viable as a rallying role. But if you're investing 5 promoted levels into a character early on, you need them to actually be good at something. You need them to contribute to combat for all that training they just did. Ultimately, most of what we've discussed until now simply isn't viable in the early game. The remaining rallies are the ones that are genuinely possible to get, and they are worth bringing. Rally speed and rally movement you will get from the Falcon Knight and Dark Flyer class respectively. You're going to pick these up anyway, and they are useful, so there's nothing bad to be said about them. The biggest weakness of these rallies is that you'll typically get them on characters who are trying to attack every single turn. However, the ability to open up new strategies by using these rallies is still valuable, and in the long term, you can pass them down to child units, or more significantly, this is a decent use case for replacing a parent unit with a child unit. If you pass down Galeforce to Severa and make her into a primary combat unit, you can have Cordelia remain on the team, taking up your 13th or 14th space on your roster, where her only job is to sit in the back, use rally speed, rally move, and rescue stabs whenever she needs to, And honestly, this is a solid way to extend the lifespan of a unit who otherwise might become obsolete later on, or who you wish to rotate out of the spotlight for personal reasons. This doesn't really apply to Cordelia because she's great long term, but still it's a decent enough example. The other option would be to pass down the rally skill to the child unit. Because child units have low stats and they're under-leveled, their combat can hold them back. But if their only job is to stand there and use a rally skill, then their low stats ultimately won't matter. Either way, with rally skill and rally movement, they're on the way and they're worth getting, so they are among the most significant rallies that you might actually see get used in a no-grinding context. On that note, Rally Magic, Rally Resistance, and Rally Luck also fit into the same scope. You get them from Sage, Valkyrie, and War Cleric, and all three of those classes are worth leveling into no matter what you're doing, so Maribel or Lissa can double their utility value by standing in the back, not only as primary staff users, but also having the ability to increase the magic, resistance, or luck of the nearby allies on a turn where buffing is more important than healing or using rescue. I think Rally Resistance is better than Rally Defense, simply because enemy mages tend to be a bigger problem when you do encounter them. I'd be interested to know if people have found more effective or more creative ways to use rallies, but for me, in a no-grinding context, it can often be a difficult puzzle to solve, and I'm not the kind of player who typically makes the best use of rallies. I'll admit that. That's a bit of a blind spot in my gameplay. I do suspect the majority of answers are going to revolve around grinding to get a bunch of rally skills onto one character, and this can be immensely satisfying to pull off, but it doesn't work particularly well in a situation where you're unable to grind, especially because you need to keep resetting your weapon rank back to E as you're jumping around between these different class lines. Having said that, rally builds are another area where Gen 2 units really shine, because they often have the luxury of inheriting one rally skill from a parent, not needing to go out of their way to get it, and then leveling up with the child. You can have them go down a path that gives them a different rally with no redundancy and no wasted levels. A good example of this would be passing down rally speed to Brady. He's unable to get this on his own naturally, so that alone is valuable. Then, Brady could promote into a Sage so that he can learn rally magic on his own. Now you have a unit capable of increasing both the speed and magic of nearby allies, which is a massive acceleration to your offense. Vaike, Gaius, Gregor, Donald, and even Henry are capable of passing down rally strength to Brady directly, although I feel like in every single one of these cases, it will either happen much later, or it will significantly hamper the father character. However, I'm not against the idea of sacrificing a parent in order to make the child stronger, and still, in that instance, it gives the ability for Brady to boost the strength, magic, and speed of all surrounding allies, which is going to consolidate a powerful offensive push into a single deployment slot. So that is really worth considering. Regardless, with all of these concepts having been discussed, you should be able to come up with a way to fill your roster with 12 characters who all feel like they are making genuine contributions to the battle. Let's review the team composition one more time. We have a primary tank with Nosferatu and a partner who supports this character. An alternate primary tank using Nosferatu, Sol, or just having really good enemy phase like Frederick, and then you want a partner who supports this character. Third, you're going to have a solid player phase removal unit who probably needs to have Galeforce, and a partner who can accelerate their offense, especially with stuff like Hex, Anathema, critical hits, dual strikes, or other useful offensive skills. And you're going to want a second player phase removal character, especially someone who can be flexible on player and enemy phase, with a fourth strong support partner to support this character. This pair is going to be something like what we discussed with Lonku, where he can remove an enemy, but you can also have him switch around and dodge tank if he really needs to. With our player phase removal units, it can often be useful if the lead and pair up unit can switch back and forth depending on the situation. Frederick hits harder than Cordelia, and he can use axes when he needs to, but Cordelia is more likely to double. By training them both, we have a duo that is both deadly and has flexibility, while also outputting high damage on dual strikes. Speaking of dual strikes, another good thing this pair-up can do is have Cordelia equip the Beast Killer, and then have Frederick attack with the Hand Axe. This will bait in attacks from the Beast Killer. The reason why you'd want to do this is if the enemy has counter and you can't one-shot them. Using a Hand Axe will prevent you from taking counter damage, and Cordelia's dual strikes will still deal full 3 times effective Beast Killer damage. This is another reason why Archer Crom and archers in generals are so good, because your lead unit can attack in ways where they're not dealing counter damage to themselves, and the archer can land effective 3 times damage with their bow, with their dual strikes. Now, after you decide on these 8 characters, we're going to fill the remaining spots with staff users, dancers, and rally users, though for the most part you want to put an emphasis on staff users. Even if you have a few staff users already in your core combat group of 8 units, it can honestly be worth filling up the remaining slots with filler staff users, just because staff access is genuinely that powerful in this game. It is worth fielding filler staff users. Oh, and also, if there's chests on the map, don't forget to deploy a unit with lock touch. If you forget to do this, you're going to be in trouble. But we always have Anna for that, and she's a great staff user as well. In the spirit of Anna, I'll do a little bit of self-promotion here. Leave a like on this video if you learned anything useful, and sub to the channel if you want to see more content like this. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day.